Beto, no. Did you swallow that, did you? Come on, Mommy. Let's go see Mommy, okay? Come on, let's go see Mommy.
I've been wanting to strip and repaint the windows for a while now. And I knew also the danger of lead paint. But I didn't stop and think how dangerous can be for Beto. My wife heard a story on the news that old paint can have lead in it. And lead can cause health problems for little kids. So now we're playing it safe and keeping Beto far away from my projects.
While most common sources of lead exposure can include old pipes and even soil, the most prevalent source is lead-based paint.
Paints that we use today around the house, for example, do not have the high levels of lead that they used to many years ago. So it's the old paint that we're really concerned about, paint on windowsills and on woodwork and so on. And in this case on those chips, which are old paint. Scientists have found that kids who eat those chips have impaired intelligence, lower IQs. And because of that, therefore, we're very concerned about kids getting exposed to lead.
Everything, including our bodies, is made up of chemicals. Chemicals are the building blocks of the world around us. We eat and drink chemicals to live. They're used to make clothes, computers, automobile parts, fuels, furniture, drugs, cosmetics, and to prepare and preserve foods. Chemicals are used in house cleaning supplies, gardening materials, and in keeping swimming pools and spas clean. Hazardous chemicals may be found almost anywhere. People need to be aware of the chemicals they come into contact with each day and be equipped with an effective way to evaluate any potential risks and answer the question, is it safe?
There are some chemicals for which people are exquisitely sensitive to, and there are some chemicals which are pretty toxic, and everybody, it will show effects. Whether or not you're going to get adverse effects from a chemical depends on the properties of that chemical, what kind of effects it can produce, and it depends on the potency, how potent it is, it depends on how long you are exposed to that chemical, and it depends on your sensitivity to that particular chemical, and it depends on how much enters the body.
This basic concept of toxicology, known as the dose makes the poison, was developed nearly 400 years ago by a well-known physician known as Paracelsus.
He recognized that low doses would sometimes do beneficial things, and as you pushed the dose up, eventually you got to the point where the dose, in fact, was producing bad things. So he made that statement, the dose makes the poison, and toxicologists adopted that as our motto. If you take a fraction of a dose of aspirin, for example, it isn't going to really do a lot to your system. If you have a headache and take several aspirins, it will probably alleviate your headache. If you increase the number of aspirin you take, say you take 100 aspirin, for example, then you're in the range where it is likely to produce injury. So as you increase the dose, you increase the likelihood that that chemical is going to produce a harmful effect in your system. So what you need to know is what kind of harm it's going to produce and what dose is required to produce that harm.
An example of a potentially harmful dosage can be found in something we're all familiar with, vitamin A.
Vitamin A, or retinol, commonly occurs in vegetables, it occurs in fruits, it occurs in fish. It can be formed from beta-carotene, and beta-carotene is an orange material. It's what gives the orange color to squash and to carrots. Retinol, as vitamin A, of course, is essential. We need that in order for our function. But high doses of retinol cause central nervous system damage, and particularly in children.
The fact that some substances are much more toxic than others means that their dosage has to be closely controlled, which is another way of limiting exposure. A good example is a blood thinner that many older adults take to guard against blood clots that may cause strokes or heart attacks. Known by its brand names as Coumadin or pan-warfarin, the basic chemical in this anticoagulant is called warfarin.
Warfarin is another very interesting chemical that initially was found in an agricultural setting. Livestock were eating clover, and sometimes the clover was spoiled. And when these livestock would eat the spoiled clover, they would hemorrhage. And for a long time, of course, people thought that was something they wanted to avoid.
The people at the University of Wisconsin recognized that that would be a therapeutically desirable material if they could identify it, which they did. And they synthesized it, and they named it warfarin.
Warfarin was originally marketed as a rat poison. It caused rodents to die from internal bleeding. When the dosage was reduced to much smaller amounts, doctors discovered that warfarin worked very well as an anticoagulant, thinning the blood just enough to prevent clotting. Since blood clots can be very dangerous to older adults who are susceptible to strokes and heart attacks.
As I've gotten older, I'm developing poor blood circulation. Since the doctor started me on warfarin, I know my chances of developing a blood clot have gone way down, and I don't have to worry so much about heart problems.
The dose makes the poison is important to toxicologists because we need to figure out what doses do cause harm.
So what you need to know is what kind of harm it's going to produce and what dose is required to produce that harm. And that's why we use the system RITE, R-I-T-E. RITE stands for the risk is equal to the toxicity times the exposure. And we're defining the toxicity as what that chemical is capable of doing and its potency for doing that. And we're defining the exposure as the concentration of that material and the length of time you're exposed to it. And those two things together determine how much of that material gets into your body, reaches the receptor, and produces the adverse effect.
I use RITE to figure out my risk of exposure to ozone on any given day. Ozone makes me sick, but only if there's a lot of it. I look up ozone levels in the paper. If they're in the green rather than red or purple, I know I won't be at risk because my exposure to ozone will be low. When the ozone levels are up a bit, I walk in the park where there's no traffic and my exposure to ozone won't be as high.
That's an example of RITE. She avoids exposure to ozone by figuring out to do her jogging in the morning or in the park, at which time the levels of ozone would be lower.
When the doctor prescribed my blood thinner, the first thing I did was do my research.
Research can include talking to your doctor or your pharmacist, or even searching online.
I found out that at high doses, warfarin can be very dangerous. So it's very risky if you're not careful about how much you take.
If you know whether that chemical can hurt you, what kind of damage it can produce, and if you know what kind of exposure is required to produce that effect, then you can evaluate that chemical and decide about the risk.
And scientists develop these thresholds through thorough and systematic research into a chemical's toxicity.
The government and scientists and regulators and risk assessors try to help by putting labels on products. They put package inserts in some products. There's signs in some places, in certain states especially. You get a lot of feedback on what might be harmful in your environment. But nevertheless, it really does still take some personal responsibility to understand what might be a risk to you.
Toxicity, risk, and exposure. 3 issues we all need to understand and learn to manage in our lives. If you'd like to learn more about the safety of chemicals and toxins in your environment, simply go to www.toxedfoundation.org. You'll find timely information as well as links to other organizations such as the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences.